This is Straight No Chaser Talk Radio. We're just getting started. Straight No Chaser Talk Radio.
He's drinking that with no chaser.
Welcome to Straight No Chaser. So grab a glass and join your hosts, your girl Ann BZ, Thin Bad, and the Chief. Welcome to Straight No Chaser. Trying to fight these allergies this evening.
Oh, man.
Watch out.
Come
man.
on.
Watch out.
Oh, my goodness. That's not good. Welcome to Straight No Chaser. Well, we never dilute the issues. We only serve the hard stuff. It's the Chief, and I'm here this evening with my two incredible co-hosts, Ann Beasy.
Hey.
And, of course, Brother Thin Bad.
Hey.
Well, tonight, we're talking about an issue that has raised concerns again in the communities, in certain communities, and that is the issue around police-involved shootings. Police-involved shootings occur across the country every day. It's not a common thing in every jurisdiction, but they do occur, and they occur when an officer or officers are conducting police-related activities, and they find themselves in a circumstance where they have to use, or as they say in the business, where they have to deploy deadly force. As we see in the past couple of weeks, we had an incident in Dallas where the officer went to the wrong apartment and at the end of the day ended up killing the innocent person that lived inside, who was eating a bowl of ice cream at the time. And then we had the recent incident in Fort Worth, Texas, which is right outside of Dallas, where an officer was called to a check on the welfare, and during the course of that investigation, one of the occupants of the residence was killed. So it's been quite a couple of weeks for the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and of course, whenever these situations happen, they create concern among the community. So tonight we're going to have a discussion about police shootings. Are they mistakes, or are they considered murder? So I'll let you jump right into it, Thin Bad and Ambezy, and of course, you know I will have my thoughts as well to share.
Man, I'm just so tired of having to talk about this, man. Like, I just think that although police-involved shootings have always been a thing, it just seems like they're so increased now. But I don't really know if it's because, like, there's really an increase in these situations happening, or just because of the state of the media. Because, you know, back in the civil rights era, you had all kind of corrupt police officers doing things to people of color and whatnot. But, you know, some of these situations are just really crazy. I mean, I look at the Amber Geiger situation, the Dallas officer who thought she was in her own apartment even though she had to break in. You know, that's none of my business. But she thought she was in her own apartment and shot Botham Jean, and that was a crazy incident. And now we have this incident where, you know, the lady's in her house playing video games with her nephew, and the neighbor called for a wellness check, and they shot through the window and just took her out. So I just I guess my first question would be for you, Chief, because what is actually the protocol for things like this? Like, when is an officer actually supposed to use deadly force?
Well, that's a good question, Ambezy, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. And I'll just go right to the Fort Worth case that is in the news right now. I just happened to listen to the press conference that the attorney held who is representing the family. and he said a couple of things that I found interesting. He was talking about the tactics that were employed by the officer prior to the deadly encounter. Now, when I listened to the description of what the officers did as they approached the building, I really didn't have a problem with the way they approached the building. When officers are dispatched to certain calls, particularly a check on the welfare, you never know what you're going to find. And certainly when they arrive and they find an open door, and based on what the dispatcher gave them, and I don't know, but certainly approaching with stealth or a degree of stealth is not an inappropriate thing to do in that circumstance, because you don't know what you have. You may just have a neighbor that left the door unlocked and went down the street to choir rehearsal. You may have a medical emergency that's going on, or you may have a situation where the neighbor actually gave you information that's going to allow you to interrupt some type of break-in in progress. So there's a host of things that could have occurred in that situation that the officers have to be prepared for. And so according to the lawyer, the officers, they approached, they parked down the street, they approached the house on foot, they eventually went around to the rear. From what he describes, they went past a couple of open doors. Now there, I have a couple of concerns, but we'll save that. They went past the open door, and they eventually ended up at the window. Now, when they ended up at the window, that's where you have things sort of going downhill. The officer saw someone in the window, gave a command to show me your hands, and literally a couple of seconds after that, he fired his weapon. Let's take a listen to that so we can kind of talk about that.
Jefferson's home in Fort Worth. The screen door is closed, the solid door is open, and the lights are on inside. The officer walks the perimeter of the house. Then, as he approaches a window,
"Put your hands up! Show me your hands!"
The officer had fired within only a couple of seconds after shouting his verbal command, and never did he identify himself as police.
So you heard right there, and I think that's one of the things that you were concerned about, Mbeezy, was the tactics that occurred once he reached that point of the residence. Mm-hmm. As you heard and that is footage from CNN from the officer's body cam, that the officer said, "Show me your hands," and then he fired a weapon and he struck the young lady and killed her right there on the scene. And unfortunately, this happened in front of her 8-year-old nephew after they were playing video games. So that's kind of an overview of what happened. So the tactics leading up to the window, they weren't so horrible. Now, passing that open door is something, that does create some concern, but some of the other things they did were not horrible. But of course, the tragic incident was when he went to the window. Now, you asked about use of force, Mbeezy. Mm-hmm. Well, when he or she uses force, he or she is trained in something called the use of force continuum. Now, I'm not going to get into great detail, but what it says in essence is that there is a continuum of options that the officer has available to him or her when it comes to using force. Now, the first thing on the use of force continuum is the mere presence of the officer. So when the officer is standing in front of that person or standing in front of that location, just the fact that he or she is there in uniform or in something that identifies him or her as a law enforcement person, that is the first level of the use of force continuum. Now, after that, then of course the officer has available verbal commands, which the officer used right there. And then if verbal commands don't work, if it's appropriate and if they can get to it in time, depending on what they find, then they have other options. They have hand-to-hand options. They have less lethal technology, the taser, beanbag devices, and tear gas, just a host of other less lethal options are available to the officer. And then if none of those options work, of course, the officer can move into the use of deadly force. Now, of course, a lot of things have to happen, and they don't happen slowly. Now, let me say that the officer may not get there and say, okay, I'm Officer Thinbad, and they wait a few minutes. They say, oh, you're not responding? Now let me go to this thing. You're not responding to that? Sometimes it's very quick, in a matter of nanoseconds that the officer has to make that decision whether or not they're going to deploy deadly force. But deadly force, of course, is the last resort, and it's obviously the most lethal resort that an officer has available to them. And so that's why officers are trained and retrained in how to use force and when is the appropriate time to use force in particular situations. Now, in this particular, the other dynamic you have here, of course, Ambezi and Thinbad, is that there were reports that the occupant of the home had a weapon. Now, Texas is a stand your ground state. Now, we've all discussed some of the pros and cons of stand your ground, but in this circumstance, think about this. You are in your home. You hear commotion outside of your home. You are allowed to have a weapon, and I think most reasonable people, if they hear commotion in their yard and they're not expecting company, they're going to check out what in the hell is going on. So the officer may have, in fact, seen the lady come to the window with a weapon in her hand, but certainly she didn't know there was the police. She didn't know they were coming, and the guy didn't say police. So, now what you have is a dead citizen and an officer that's been involved in a deadly force incident, and you have one hell of a mess on your hand.
So, in this specific situation that everybody's talking about now, do you think it was justified?
Do I think the use of force was justified? Yeah. Well, I can't say, and only because I don't agree with it. I have a lot of concerns with it. But, there's certain things, Ambezi, that officers are supposed to do when they're approaching a scene where there's the possibility you may have to deploy deadly force. Number one, as you're approaching the house, you certainly want to put yourself in a position where you have a second or two to see what's going on. Now, all the time, cover and concealment isn't available, and you have to put it out there. But based on what I saw from the video, it looked like there were some other options there that would have given the officer the opportunity to either conceal himself or protect himself behind an object that bullets would not be able to penetrate, to give him an extra second or two to make a good decision. But certainly going to deadly force as quickly as he did is something that's going to have to be investigated, and they're going to have to look at what did he see, what did he not see, what did the other officers on the scene see, what did they perceive. There's just a lot of questions that need to be answered, and I'm kind of answering this as a former police chief because there's so many things you need to see. However, let me say this. The shooting did give me a great deal of concern, and I certainly hope that they will get to the bottom of what this officer saw. And they probably have enough information to show that based on their interviews, based on a review, an enhanced view of that tape and other things, that they felt that murder charges were warranted. And certainly if that's what the information revealed, then I certainly support that the officer was charged in the way that he was.
I think this theory needs to be debunked too. So, when situations like this happen, does public pressure ever play into the charges that are brought against the officers?
Well, I think certainly public pressure and public perception and politics play into those decisions. Absolutely. I think that people do think about, okay, what will the public think about this?
If
now,
we don't charge
right. It shouldn't play into your decisions, because at the end of the day, the prosecutor wants, or the DA or the U.S. attorney, whoever's handling the case, wants